After Percy left to help build a new harbor, Duck was left to manage the yards alone. He did so easily and made everything run like clockwork. The freight cars behaved well. The coaches sang happily, and the passengers didn't complain. One morning, Duck had brought James's coaches to the platform. He had just started to shunt Henry's freight cars when the yardmaster ran over. One of James's coaches had had a hot axle box. "Can you fetch another, please?" "Certainly, sir," replied Duck, and he puffed doodlily away to the carriage shed. He soon arrived. The big mainline coaches stood in long lines, but James was pulling smaller red coaches, so Duck had to puff into the back of the shed. He had rarely been in so far. "I must sort this place out," he thought to himself. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted. "Hello," called a weak voice. Duck jumped. Who was that?" he gasped. Oh, only us, dear," came the quiet reply. Duck squinted into the darkness. There, standing tucked far at the back of the shed behind big express coaches, stood 3 little old coaches. They had wooden bodies and shabby paintwork. "Goodness me," puffed Duck. "I didn't know you lot were back here." "No one does," sighed one coach. "They've all forgotten about us," whispered another. "We've been here since that little green engine put us here," finished the third. "That must have been Percy," Duck smiled. "Just how long have you been in here?" "It's been years," they all said in unison. Duck felt sorry for them. "Oh, I am sorry. Perhaps I could get you out again sometime." "Oh, no, cried the coaches together. "We're out of date now. They never want to keep us. They'd have us scrapped." Duck was aghast. "Nonsense." "It's true," said the frontmost coach. "Just look at us. There's no need for us now. Not with all the nice new coaches you have now." Duck hated to admit it, but they were right. Even the coaches he'd come to collect was nicer than the old ones, and there were plenty of these new ones. "I'm sorry, my dears," sighed Duck. "I wish I could help you." "It's all right," murmured the coaches. "At least we're safe here." Duck suddenly remembered why he was there. Apologizing, he puffed out of the sheds, wondering how he could help the coaches. James was waiting crossly for him at the platform. "So much for your Western way. Where have you been?" he grumbled. "I'm sorry, James," said Duck, and he explained about the coaches. "I do wish I could help them." James laughed. "What, those old things? Forget it. They're relics." Duck scowled at James before he puffed away back to his work. But for the rest of the day, he kept thinking about the coaches. Surely they might be needed somewhere, he thought to himself. But try as he might, he couldn't think of anything. The big engines looked on with quiet amusement as Duck set about his work. "It's silly, really," said Gordon. "But then, he is a little engine after all." "At least it keeps him quiet," sniggered Henry. Edward puffed past, eyeing the big engines as he went. "Those engines aren't picking on you, are they, Duck?" he asked. Duck was surprised. "What? Oh, no, Edward." "Then why the long face?" Duck sighed and explained the situation. "I do feel sorry for them," he sighed. Edward gave a comforting smile. "Well, it's very kind of you to think about them, Duck. I'm sure they'd appreciate that." "Thank you, Edward, but I don't feel that's—" Duck suddenly stopped. "Edward, you're it!" "I'm it?" The old engine was rather puzzled. "Yes, of course," smiled Duck. "Couldn't they run on your line? You don't have many coaches. Having spares might be handy." Edward smiled. "Oh, yes, I could." You could maybe even run special vintage trains, seeing as you all are quite old, begging your pardon. Edward had to laugh at that. I think that's a splendid idea, Duck. I suggested to Sir Topham Hatt. Duck did so. Sir Topham Hatt thought it was a grand idea. The old coaches sat sad and alone, tucked away at the back of the shed, when suddenly... "Hello again," smiled Duck as he was coupled up. "What's happening?" cried the coaches, fear creeping into their voices. "Oh, don't you worry," comforted Duck. "There's no cause for alarm. We found a new place for you all," he excitedly explained. The coaches were touched. "Thank you, dear," they smiled. Duck grinned in return. "Now let's get you all to the works." The coaches were soon restored to their former glory, and they now lived at Edward Station. And every weekend, Edward takes them out on special trains. The coaches love their new life, and Duck is very pleased to have helped them find their new purpose. Toby the Tram Engine was amazed. There, standing before him, was the legendary old warrior. Thomas had scared Toby by telling him it was a ghost, but in reality, it was a little engine called Bertram, who turned out to be very friendly. "Just wait until I tell the others about this," laughed Toby. Later the next morning, he met Thomas at the station. "So, the old warrior didn't hunt you down last night then?" Thomas teased. "Quite the opposite," replied Toby excitedly. "I actually found him. He's a little old engine called Bertram, not a ghost." Thomas just laughed. "Really, Toby? Trying to use my own tale against me? You might fool Percy, but you have to wake up earlier to trick me." Thomas had heard the legend of the old warrior from his driver, and thought it nothing more than silly make-believe. Nothing Toby could say managed to convince Thomas about Bertram's authenticity. It didn't help that Bertram had been sent to the works, leaving Thomas unable to see him for himself. It was a few weeks later when Toby's driver woke him excitedly. "Wake up, Toby! We've had a special delivery to take to the mines." Toby was excited, especially when he finally saw what it was. "Bertram, how nice it is to see you again," he beamed. "You look very smart now." "I feel like a young engine again," Bertram croaked. "It's a shame I don't sound it." He still sounded rather hoarse from his years in isolation. As they made their way to the mines, Toby explained all that had happened in Bertram's absence, including Thomas's lack of belief. When he finished, Bertram laughed. "Thinks I'm still a legend, does he? What fun! He'll certainly have a shock when he does sees me. Just think of the look on his face." It was then Toby had an idea. That evening, Thomas arrived at the mines with the last supply train. "We're here on guard tonight, lad. Vat controller's orders," called the driver. Thomas was cross. He wanted to be back in his warm shed, but he knew there was nothing he could do. Night quickly fell, and Thomas was still grumpy, but he couldn't help but feel slightly uneasy. "It's that Toby filling my smokebox with that silly legend," he muttered to himself. He was just starting to relax when suddenly, "Thomas! Thomas!" Thomas froze. A chill ran through his boiler as a ghostly cackle echoed around him. Who's there?" he stammered, trying to sound as brave as he could. "I've come to get you, Thomas," wailed the voice. "You should have believed." Suddenly, a shrill whistle cried out. Poor Thomas was so frightened, he shot back right into the buffers. Oh, goodness me, chuckled Bertram in his poor old voice. You look as if you've seen a ghost. Thomas' eyes shot open. There, beside him, were Toby and Bertram, with innocent grins on their faces. Thomas then burst out laughing. Oh, you win, Toby. I was a silly engine to not believe you. It's very nice to meet you, old warrior, he added happily. As it is to meet you, Bertram smiled. I hope I didn't scare you too much. Everyone laughed, before the three engines began to chat happily away like old friends. Duck kept the yard running smoothly. The coaches admired his gentle shunting. The freight cars behaved themselves, and trains were always ready to time. Shipshape and Sweden fashion, Duck would say. The engines were impressed. Sir Topham had even more so. You've proved yourself a most dedicated engine, he said grandly. Perhaps you could be of assistance outside of the yard too. So Duck soon found himself making occasional excursions along the main line, doing odd jobs when acquired, a position which gave him great pride. Not to say that it's wrong having little Duck out and about, murmured Henry. He does work hard after all. But it's not the done thing, having little tank engines playing about on the main line, finished Gordon loftily. Is that so? Came a voice. Then perhaps, if you feel that way, Gordon, you could take my freight cars for me. I'm sure it could be arranged, Duck added sweetly. Gordon was horrified at such a notion. Henry found it hard to contain his laughter. A few days later, a line of empty vans was needed at Edward Station. Duck was delighted to take them. Whilst he enjoyed the main line in full, he liked visiting Edward Station best of all. He ambled gaily along, the vans rumbling beautifully behind. You look cheerful, smiled Edward when at last the little train reached its destination. It is good to see you again. Oh, indeed, beamed Duck. But before he could say another word, the air was filled with a thunderous noise. With a rattle and a roar, and a bellow of his whistle, Gordon and the express tore past. It rattled by with such force, Duck thought he might get blown over. There's someone in high spirits, grinned Edward. I can't help but think he's trying to show me up, murmured Duck, a display of what a proper mainline engine looks like. Edward raised an inquisitive eyebrow, so Duck quickly explained about the others as he tied his vans away. When he had finished, Edward grinned once again. Some engines never change. I wouldn't pay them any mind. Oh, don't worry. I know better than to fret over silly little things, Duck winked. The two engines laughed and chatted as quickly as they could before it was time for Duck to leave. But he hadn't long started away before he spotted a red signal up ahead. Hello, called the driver. I wonder what the matter could be. Duck drew to a halt beside the box as the Cinnamon leaned out to them. There's trouble at the next station, he called. Gordon's safety valve has burst. Relief is on its way, but they've asked if you can shut Gordon out of the way. Duck couldn't help but smirk. Right away, sir, he whistled as he scampered away. When he arrived, he found Gordon in a pitiful state. He stood short of the platform, staring meekly at his buffers, The buzz of angry passengers erupted from the coaches. Duck quickly ran around the train and was coupled to Gordon. He pulled the big engine away to the yard in silence and stood with him as Henry rode into view. The passengers cheered, and in no time at all, Henry was coupled to the train and away, whistling cheekily to Gordon as he passed. Duck couldn't help but feel sorry for the big engine, but all the same, he couldn't resist himself. "It's not a done thing, playing about on the main line, is it, Gordon?" Gordon said nothing. He just brooded in a bitter silence. Thomas was away at the works, so Duck had been called in to help in Thomas's absence. He already knew Percy and was soon friends with Toby too. Annie and Clarabelle were very pleased to go out with him. "He's such a gentleman," they whispered to each other. They'd almost prefer him to Thomas. Duck had yet to meet everyone on the branch line. And one morning, as he sat happily at the station, Bertie Bus came racing up. "Hello," he tooted happily. "You must be Duck. I'm Bertie." "Good morning," smiled Duck in return. "It's nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you too," grinned Bertie. "Always nice to see a new face. Beats seeing old Thomas anyways." Duck chuckled. He was beginning to like this bus. "I say, you wouldn't fancy a race, would you?" Bertie ventured. Duck frowned. "A race? That's hardly a proper thing to do." "Oh, but it's quite fun," chirped Bertie. "Me and Thomas have once before, and—" "Racing about is dangerous," cut in Duck cordially. "I do my work properly, thank you." He puffed away before Bertie could say another word. For the rest of the day, Duck took no notice of Bertie whenever the two passed. He thought Bertie was silly and wanted nothing more to do with him. But the next morning, Duck was feeling cheerful again. He collected the coaches and set off happily along the line. Come along, he called. We're coming along, sang the coaches in reply. They were just rounding a bend when Duck suddenly noticed something. A tree had fallen onto the line in front of them. Stop! Cried Duck in alarm. The driver applied the brakes, and Duck drew to a thankful stop. We'll have to go back to the last station, sighed the driver. But just then they heard a voice. Can I be of help? There was Bertie on the road beside them. This time, Duck was glad to see him. Please, can you send for help? He asked. I could do more than that, replied Bertie. If I drop my passengers off, I can come back for yours and get them to the station. That would be splendid, smiled Duck, relieved. So Bertie hurried away. And before long, he had collected Duck's passengers too. He went as quickly as he could, and they arrived at the station on time. Everyone gave him their thanks. Later that day, when the line was clear, Duck met Bertie again. Thank you for helping me, he said. I'm sorry I was so rude. I guess there are advantages to racing about after all, grinned Bertie cheekily. The two laughed, and before long, they were chatting together like old friends. Henry was a happy engine once again. He had been let out of his tunnel. He was now back to work, pulling the heavy express with Edward. The two engines were running the train until Gordon's burst safety valve had been mended. It was the next day when Gordon returned to work. It's good to be back, he said. I did miss the express yesterday. Thank you for taking care of it. Edward and Henry smiled. They both had fun pulling it. "We look splendid pulling it," said Henry. "You look even smarter when you've been repainted." Gordon chuckled. "Blue is a proper color for an engine." Henry smiled. He was looking forward to his repaint. He had to wait for Gordon to return to work before getting his reward. "I hear you've got a special job yourself," said Henry. Gordon was surprised. "A special job? I didn't know. What is it?" "I think it's a special express train," said Edward. "Driver says it leaves early tomorrow morning." Gordon liked the sound of that. "2 express trains tomorrow? Just what a fine engine needs. It will be nice to have a good run." Edward and Henry were happy for Gordon, and the 3 engines chatted happily for the rest of the evening, which kept the other engines awake. The driver and fireman arrived early the next morning, but Gordon was already awake. "So, you know about the special train," said the driver. "Yes, I do," said Gordon. "We better be off as soon as we can." The driver laughed as the fireman lit the fire. Soon, they had made a nice lot of steam. The lever was pulled, and Gordon puffed away to find his train. But when he found his train, he was shocked. "Trucks?" Gordon cried. "Yes, trucks," said the driver. "It's a special express goods train. It must get to the end of the line quickly. That's why you were chosen." Gordon was cross. "I don't pull dirty trucks." But there was nothing he could do. He moaned as the shunter fastened the coupling. The guard blew his whistle from his van, and Gordon slunk away. "It's not right, it's not right, it's not right," he thought as he left. As he puffed away, Lucille passed by on the other line, laughing as she went. Gordon was crosser still, and made a face at her. "If I'm to pull trucks, I won't be seen pulling them," he said to himself as he began to go faster. Soon he was puffing quickly along, as fast as he went with the express. Towns, fields, and bridges flashed by as Gordon sped past. "Hurry, hurry, hurry," he puffed to himself. He was going so quickly that the trucks dared not to make a sound. Gordon puffed so quickly that he arrived at the station early. Everyone was very impressed. Gordon was too cross to care. He was uncoupled from the trucks and set off back home to collect his express. The fat director was waiting for him when he arrived. "Well, Gordon, you've done a splendid job," he said, "but I think we'll let some of the other engines manage the trucks for now. You make a fine goods engine, but you need an even better express engine." Gordon was happy, and with that, he steamed away. James had not pulled passengers in a long while. Sir Topham Hatt had punished him for being lazy and having Henry take his train. The big green engine was now at the works for repairs, leaving James with all his goods work. In James's absence, the service had become so popular extra coaches had been added to the train, making it much longer and heavier to pull. As James topped up on water, he watched as 8 coaches were shunted into the station. "Blimey," muttered the driver. "Gordon will have his work cut out for him pulling that lot." "Pah! Who cares? The passengers should be treated to a splendid journey by a splendid engine like me," snorted James rudely as his fireman finished filling up his tender. Lots of the passengers came and crowded the station platform. James felt very jealous as he watched Gordon glide to a stop in front of the coaches. He looked very grand. "Hello there, Widow James. Still acting like a goods engine, are you? Oh well, I suppose we can't all pull the express." Gordon grinned. James, from his isolated siding, rolled his eyes, but Gordon didn't care. The conductor's whistle blew, and with a sharp whistle, Gordon snorted away. His wheels slipped as he dragged the heavy coaches out of the station. James was about to set off to arrange his train when he noticed something. There, at the back of the train, was a very tired Percy. "What are you doing back there?" asked James sharply. Percy was still trying to catch his breath. At last, he explained about how he had been helping the express start by pushing it. "It's exhausting. I have to do all the heavy work while Gordon gets all the praise." James started laughing, taking Percy off guard. "Ha! Gordon still needs a push to get started. I'd be humiliated if I need a baggage to push behind my train." James chortled away as Percy let off steam crossly. A few days later, Sir Topham Hatt came to speak to James in the sheds. James looked a little worried. "I've been very impressed with all your hard work of recent, James. Henry will be returning from the work soon, so how would you like to pull the express again?" "Oh, yes, please, sir," whistled James happily. Sir Topham Hatt smiled and tipped his hat to his engine. He turned and stepped into his car. James's crew prepared his fire and set off to the station. He backed onto his coaches, and the passengers boarded the long train. Percy was waiting at the back of the train to help it start, but James was having none of it. "Clear off, little Percy. I don't need a grubby little engine like you spoiling the look of my train." Percy was most offended. He steamed away, muttering under his breath. At last, the conductor blew his whistle, and James responded with a whim, his wheels spinning furiously. "Don't need a back engine, don't need a back engine," he growled, as with one final slip, he got the train into motion, hauling out of the station. Soon James was flying down the line. Now he was moving the train with greater ease, but James had to admit to himself the train was much too heavy for him. "Never mind, I'll do it, never mind, I'll do it," he puffed to himself. But as he neared Wellsworth, his driver checked his speed and began to put on the brakes. "What's going on?" demanded James. "Why are we stopping?" "We'll need to call for a banker for the hill," called the driver. "Rubbish! I could do it myself," pouted James, but his driver just laughed. "You'll never manage it alone, not with all these coaches." James rode to a stop at the platform, whistling loudly for a banker. Loco had just arrived at the yards and was shunting freight cars when James whistled out. "Don't worry, James," he called. "I'll be with you in a minute." James let off steam indignantly. "Being helped by a diesel! The shame of it! I'd rather have dirty Percy at this point," he groaned. But there was nothing he could do. When Boco was ready, the train started off for the hill, with James still groaning. Now, James is a mixed traffic engine. He can pull coaches and freight cars quite easily. But although he is considered a big engine, he is smaller and weaker than Gordon and Henry. While he can pull heavy trains, like the express, his one big weakness is gradients. He had a history of struggling on Gordon's hill with the express before, and had forgotten it. But as he started up the hill with Boco, he suddenly had to admit to himself that he was thankful that Diesel was there. Come on, panted James. We're doing it, called Boco. They were just about to reach the top when, with a loud whistle, Gordon tore down the hill on the other side with a goods train. When he saw James being helped by Boco, he laughed. Ho ho! Feeling the strain, are we, James? He called as he passed. James became very angry, too angry that he began slipping violently on the hill. Boco was very surprised as he now had the weight of the whole train on him. He hooted at James in alarm. James, correct your slipping. I can't hold the train. There came a loud snap. The train stalled on the hill as the engine's crew jumped out of the cabs to see what had happened. It didn't take them long to find the problem. James's side rods had broken in half. Oh, you silly engine! All your slipping damaged your coupler, which caused your side rods to break. You won't be able to take this train any further, scolded the driver. James became flustered and looked shamefaced at his buffers. His driver then spoke to Boco's driver about taking the train on. I don't think Boco has the pulling power to carry on alone, unless... Boco's driver had made a plan. Meanwhile, Henry was building up steam in the works. He hadn't suffered much damage and was excited to go home. Then he heard a horn come from the station. He looked over and saw Bucko at the head of the express. Bucko then moved off the train and headed to the back. "Hello, Bucko," called Henry as the diesel rode towards the works. "Who is that you're shunting?" It was James. Bucko placed him right next to Henry. James blushed, and Bucko winked. "Oh, pay no attention to him, Henry. He's just my back engine. Not an important role after all," teased Bucko. Henry chortled as James went redder than ever. Just then, the station master came to see Henry about finishing the express journey. "I'd be more than happy to. It wouldn't be the first time I fill in for James." And the big green engine puffed away. James is now a lot more cautious while taking any train. He is never shy to ask for help from a back engine, and he is a much wiser engine too. One evening, Daisy ambled into the top station. She saw Toby and Terence nearby, enraptured in conversation. "Such a delightful specimen," cheered Terence. Daisy felt flattered. "Why, thank you, my dear." Toby couldn't stifle a laugh. "We weren't talking about you." "No, something better," added Terence, the disdainful look on Daisy's face not deterring his gay chatter. "We are talking about whiskey." "Farmer Wade's new horse," explained Toby. Daisy groaned. "A horse? All this about a horse? What rubbish!" Toby and Terence didn't think whiskey was rubbish, nor did the village people. Next day, Daisy felt her passengers would talk of nothing else. "Fancy getting excited by a daft animal," grunted Daisy. "It's a fine, noble creature," replied her driver. "Not feeling jealous, are we?" murmured Toby at the station by the river. That, of course, made Daisy's temper even fouler. She flounced away with a dramatic fury, but as she made her way down the line, a surprise stood waiting for her. She had barely left the tunnel when she came face to face with Whiskey. "Oh!" she hissed. "Stop!" Luckily, she stopped clear of the stray steed. Daisy had made such a noisy stop that Whiskey had turned and bolted. "Stupid thing must have escaped from his field," grumbled the driver. "I told you it was daft," snapped Daisy. "Best mention this to Farmer Wade," sighed the driver. "Must have broken a fence." They set off again, Daisy now feeling justified in her disdain for Whiskey. "I said it wasn't worth the fuss," she busted that night. "Fancy making me late. Animals are simply no good to anyone." She had been rambling all night. Thomas and Percy had retired in irritated huffs, but Toby was kept up by Daisy's gloats. "There is nothing wrong with animals," he replied at last. "Besides, I'd hardly expected an engine as capable as you to be severely delayed by such a simple thing." Daisy wisely decided to go to sleep after that. But next morning, once Toby had departed for the junction, she was back on form. "Forget silly horses," she cooed to the passengers. "You should admire a proper sight, like me." The passengers boarded swiftly, and Daisy glided away. The run down the branch went well at first. "Silly thing, no good at all," thought Daisy as she popped out of the tunnel. But as she neared the cutting, she was shocked. Whiskey had wandered free once again, but this new adventure was even more of a disaster. His head was stuck in the fence beside the line. Whiskey was in a dreadful state. "Oh, the poor thing! We must do something to help," cried Daisy, whose demeanor had instantly changed. "We can't leave it here all alone." Daisy made such a fuss, her driver stopped her. A brief inquiry amongst the passengers yielded it a vet. Although inexperienced with horses, they led an effort of several passengers, and Daisy's driver to calm poor Whiskey and set him free. The guard had run back to the cinnabox to warn of the delay and to send for Farmer Wade, who was quickly on the scene. "Why, bless you all," he sighed. "I hadn't time to mend my fence yesterday. Old Whiskey seems to like the wide world. Perhaps this may teach him to stay home." "Think nothing of it," said all the passengers involved. "It's Daisy you should think. She insisted that something must be done." "What an extraordinary engine," cheered from away kindly. Daisy blushed brightly. At last, she set off again. The passengers hadn't minded their adventure, despite its delay. When she reached the next station, Daisy found Toby and Terence gossiping. "What delayed you this time?" mused Toby. "A sheep?" The excited wave of passengers quickly filled the two in, both of whom were fully entertained. "Well, well, well," chortled Terence. "Would you ever?" "Look who's like horses after all," chirped Toby. "Oh, pooh!" scoffed Daisy. "This just proves my point. They get in the way and delayed an engine. No good at all. These daft creatures." She flounced away without another word. To this day, Daisy insists her opinions on animals, especially horses, haven't changed. But Toby and Terence think she's only pretending. Don't you? One afternoon, Mavis was bringing a load of stone down from the quarry. But as she entered the village streets, Mavis came upon the roadblock. Caroline, the vintage car, stood awkwardly across the rails. "Get out of my way!" Mavis huffed, drawing to a stop. "Oh, I am sorry, dearie," moaned Caroline. "My old engine agrees with hot days like these." "Well, kindly overheat somewhere out of my way," snapped Mavis. Caroline gave a sad sigh as her owner and the nearby loco pushed her clear of the rails. The poor car looked depressed. Mavis regretted her harsh tone. "I'm sorry. It's just Percy wouldn't let me hear the end of it if I was late," she apologized. "I'm sure you'll feel better soon," she added hastily. But Caroline just sighed. "I'm just not as young as I once was." Mavis felt sorry for her as she scampered away. At the yard, she met Toby, to whom she explained the entire ordeal. "The poor thing looks distraught," Mavis sighed. "If only her owner would sort her engine out." "I've noticed a change in her myself," confessed Toby. "Her engine could be tuned up quite easily, no doubt, but I fancy her owner isn't aware of that." "What a pity!" cried Mavis. "Oh, I do wish I could cheer her up somehow. It's the least I can do for being so rotten." "It would be a great kindness," agreed Toby, "but I'm not sure what could be done." Mavis racked her mind for an answer. "I'm sure I'll think of something," she said, but she couldn't. For several days, nothing came to mind. Until at last one day, several weeks later. "Perhaps that could work," Mavis mused. "It's at least worth a try." Late one afternoon, a few days later, Mavis was bringing another loaded train down. At the village, she saw Caroline, who looked as depressed as before. Mavis started through the village as usual, until suddenly, "Oh dear," she wailed. "Oh, I don't feel well at all." She drew to a halt, calling aloud. "Oh, I've blown the fuse! Fiddlesticks! Fudge even!" "You seem fine to me," muttered her driver. "Oh dear," called Caroline from nearby. "You poor thing!" "Caroline!" cried Mavis, acting as surprised as she could. "I hadn't seen you there." "Oh, perhaps you could help me?" Caroline was confused. "Me? Help you? I'm afraid I don't see how—" "Toby needs to come up and collect the workman," explained Mavis quickly. "But I'm in the way. If you send a word back, he can come and move me. You'd send a word much faster than my driver or guard." The plan was far from ideal. Mavis was aware of its many faults. However, Caroline seemed quite convinced. "Don't you worry, dearie," she called. "I may not be worth much, but I can certainly aid a friend." So off Caroline hurried, all the way to the nearby station, where Toby had just arrived. Caroline, after catching her breath, quickly explained the crisis. Once she had finished, Toby set off to collect Mavis. He brought her back to the stone-cutting yard. Mavis was feeling very pleased with herself. Her plan had worked. But her face suddenly fell when she saw a familiar figure nearby. "What's all this, then?" asked Sir Topham Hatt sternly. Mavis was very flustered. "Oh, I was on my way to a meeting with your owner," explained Sir Topham Hatt. "I hadn't expected to tell him about his own engine feigning an illness." "Oh, but—" "However," Sir Topham Hatt continued, "Toby here tells me you've been very concerned about old Caroline. Taking that into account, and being sure that this sort of event will not repeat itself, I can perhaps overlook at it just this once." "Oh, yes, sir, of course, sir," blurted Mavis. Her face was as bright as scarlet. Sir Topham Hatt turned and walked away. Toby chuckled quietly. "It was an interesting method, but I fancy you've cheered someone up." Toby was right. Caroline felt rejuvenated. "I feel like a young car again," she told Mavis when they next met. "Master gave my engine a proper overhaul for being so useful. Thank you ever so," she added quietly. "Where are you?" Caroline winked. "You can't fool me that easily, youngster." Mavis grinned bashfully. "Our little secret," she smiled as the two giggled happily.